Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to part two of our Let Us Reason live stream on the textual criticism, science, and specifically of the Bible. And if you joined us last time, you know that we have our dear brother, James Snapp, and he talked at that time about just the science itself, textual criticism. And then we close by making reference to two examples that we would like to explore even at a deeper level. One has to do with the ending of the Gospel of Mark, which many, of course, usually point out to, especially from our Muslim friends. They tend to point to Mark 16, starting from verse 9, as if this is a classic example in their view of the corruption of the Bible. And then, of course, you have also the passage about the woman caught in adultery, end of John 7 and the beginning of John 8. So I ask our dear brother here to come back and let us focus on them one by one. Today's topic will deal the ending of Mark. With that said, I want to welcome, of course, our dear brother here, James Snapp. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And I want to thank, of course, all of you who have been waiting for the show. Thank you for the moderators who have joined us. And I just want to give you guys a quick warning. If you see me moving things around, we're trying to make sure the pictures or the images that our brother here shared with me are accessible during the show so that we can show them to you. If we run into any snag, we'll figure out a solution to that. And he will continue to teach anyway. It's not going to stop him from doing that, but it will be neat for you folks here to watch it. With that said, brother, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll see what I can do with the pictures right now. So I'll start by asking, obviously, why is it significant for us to explore whether the ending of John was part of the gospel or not? And what evidence do we have that collaborate either view? And that's what I want you maybe to focus on.
With Mark, I think Mark is what you meant. But at the ending of the Gospel of Mark, there are 12 verses that appear in a lot of manuscripts, almost all of them. And in footnotes, people will typically see, if they notice the footnote at all, there'll be a footnote that says these manuscripts are not found in some manuscripts. And sometimes there'll be a shorter ending that says some manuscripts have this reading instead. Some manuscripts have this reading and that reading. Some manuscript footnotes will also have a mention of a interpolation after verse 14 called the Philologion. Hopefully we'll take a look at that later. And these footnotes tend to elicit a degree of doubt, which is often emphasized, I think, by people who try to bring the resurrection into question. The idea from the objection perspective is that, well, if it's so important to believe in a bodily resurrection of Christ, and I think most Christians would grant that it is, how can you have one of the four Gospels where there is no scene in which Christ bodily appears after the resurrection? And that in turn leads to people to say, well, okay, you have your Matthean Christianity, your Johannine Christianity. I'll have my Markan Christianity, in which Christ just disappears after he dies, and there's no reason to believe that Christ has come back from the dead, or in an extension of that it will come back to that. That's probably the maximum view, if I could maximize that to that extent. Of course, I'm presenting somebody else's view here, so there might be a few variations depending on who you would encounter. But that's the concern, that when people see the footnote, that they say, well, I don't know exactly what that means, that some manuscripts have it and some manuscripts don't have it. Should it be there or should it not be there in my Bible? Because when you have a Bible, you have a book that you would look to as a book of authority. And obviously, if people are going to question its legitimacy in the text, the legitimacy of this particular passage, then that's a question that I think a lot of folks would like to have answered. Now, oftentimes you'll read commentaries where the answer is no, get it out of there. And those commentaries are very many, both in print and online. There's it's kind of staggering the amount of misinformation that has been circulating online and in print about these 12 verses, and that's something that I hope that I can clear up today.
I guess my question is, when did this issue, at least historically speaking, became an issue?
Well, to a small extent, it was an issue with everybody that had read the works of Eusebius of Caesarea. He was an important writer back in the early 300s, late 200s, early 300s. Eusebius of Caesarea is probably most notable for his cross-reference system to the Gospels. In many of the manuscripts that we have today, you can see at the very beginning of the Gospels, it doesn't just start out with the four Gospels. It starts out with a brief composition called Ad Carpianus, which is just the instruction manual. It's only like a page long of how to use the cross-reference system that Eusebius has made. And after you see his instructions on how to use the Eusebian sections, then you have the Eusebian canons themselves, which is a list of numbers in 10 different lists. You have where the parallel passages are presented in different groups. You start out with the four Gospels, where there's a list of numbers where all four Gospels have something to say in this parallel passage. By the time you get to the 10th list, here are the list of passages where each one is unique in its own Gospel. And then the ones in between are different levels, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or Matthew, Luke, and John. And so that's the Eusebian canon. So Eusebius was very influential in the history of the New Testament text. But one of his letters that he wrote, and Eusebius wrote many things, but in one of his compositions called Ad Carpianus, somebody had asked Eusebius, how do I sort out this little harmonization problem between Matthew 28:2 and Mark 16:9? Now, obviously, with chapters and verses, I'm not quoting exactly, but anybody that's curious about this particular text can get a copy of Eusebius Gospel Problems and Solutions. It's been published by Roger Pierce, and you can get it online for free. The book has not only the English translation of it, but also the Greek text itself and some other things as well. So to see exactly what Eusebius said about Mark 16, 9 through 20, I would first recommend download that book and read it. And it will present Eusebius' statement very clearly. Oftentimes, Eusebius, when he's quoted, the way that Bruce Metzger quotes it, the way that commentators who have used Bruce Metzger quote it, you see just a snippet of what Eusebius says, and it'll be presented as if Eusebius said, well, Eusebius said that hardly any manuscripts have Mark 16 verses 9 through 20. And that's not quite exactly what Eusebius said. So it's important to see the nuance that Eusebius, in this letter, where one of his contemporaries, Marinus, is asking him, how do I harmonize Matthew 28:2 with the timing in Mark 16:9 about this timing of when did Jesus rise from the dead? Eusebius at first says there's two ways to solve the problem. You can say there's a twofold solution is the term that he uses, well, Greek. But he says one way you could do it was to simply, one way a person could do it is to say, well, we just don't accept those last 12 verses, and then it's a superfluous question. On the grounds that you could say, a person might say, well, those aren't in every copy. Or a person might say, those are in some copies, but not in other copies. Or those hardly ever appear. So a person on those kinds of grounds could simply dismiss the question as superfluous by rejecting the final passage there in Mark. But Eusebius then goes on to say, on the other hand, a person who does not pick and choose between this and that when he receives his text, a person who simply receives what he's been given, could say, all you need to do there in Mark 16, verse 9, is put in a pause as you're reading it and say, rising on the first day of the week, and problem solved. So Eusebius then recommends to Marinus, that's how you do it. You have this text there, just put in the pause, and harmonization problem resolved just like that. That's what Eusebius recommends to Marinus to do. He doesn't say throw out the passage. He's not insistent about that at all. And later on in the same composition, Eusebius himself, while dealing with a different question, quotes from Mark 16, verse 9 himself. So it's important to see the nuances that are in that particular composition of Eusebius. Now, during the Middle Ages, Eusebius's canon sections, the cross-reference system that he made for the Gospels, in about 15 or 16 manuscripts, it kind of depends on if you have copies or not. That is, copies of manuscripts that still exist. some of those manuscripts, what's called the F1 group, and a group of manuscripts known for having a particular note in them called the Jerusalem colophon. Those manuscripts have a kind of an interruption, at least some and some of them the note interrupts the text, and some of them it's off to the side in the margin. But they'll have a note that says after chapter 16, verse 8, the note says something like, in some of the copies, the text or the gospel is completed here, and this is as far as Eusebius took his canon tables. But then there'll be another note that says, but in many of them, these also appear, referring to verses 9 through 20. Or in some versions of the note says, but in the ancient manuscripts, these all appear. So that's the note from Family 1 and the Jerusalem colophon manuscripts. So Eusebius' statement was known and was taken into consideration, but in all those manuscripts, verses 9 through 20 are included. Also, Ambrose of Milan was aware of Eusebius's Ad Marinus. He had read that composition back in late 300s, and yet he quoted Mark 16, 9 through 20 oodles of times. Well, not oodles, but at least 4 times in his work. So this was a known controversy, known from the work of Eusebius, but also Jerome, the influential writer Jerome, who translated the Latin, a good piece of the Vulgate. Eusebius, in one of his compositions called Ad Hedibium, epistle number 120, as he's answering Hedibia's questions, one of her questions, a very broad question, basically it's, what do you do, how do you harmonize the differences with what happens after Jesus rises from the dead? And Eusebius, as a way of answering that very broad question, translates and condenses the work of Eusebius, who's dealing with the same kind of issues, but he's dealing with Marinus's questions. So Jerome, to save time, takes a piece of Eusebius's questions and answers, and translates them into Latin, and gives that in his composition. So we often see references that say Eusebius and Jerome said this, but really the Jerome part is Jerome boiling down and putting into Latin the things that Eusebius had said to Marinus 100 years before. So,
I mean, let me ask if you don't mind. I mean, someone going to ask, and I see someone who's asking this, and I think it's the right question. They're going to say at the end of the day, so what? What is it that the Christians have to get out of all of this? All I can tell you, brother, is, of course, it's always been pointed out this is not part of it. I remember my days in the seminary. One of my professors says, I wouldn't really preach a whole lot out of Mark, 16:9. Now, I thought to myself, when somebody said that, I said, wow, why shouldn't I preach from Mark 16:9? It's there in my Bible. Why shouldn't I? So who else in the early history of the church used it, like from the church fathers, for instance, as part of the canon?
Well, in the early church fathers, the evidence is extremely widely supported for inclusion of the passage. Eusebius is sometimes looked upon as an authority on the text because he lived at Caesarea. And now we don't have a whole lot of text critical comments that he made, and we probably wouldn't accept the ones that he did. His line of reasoning was different than your typical, more scientific approach would be today. The same thing goes for Origen. Origen makes some text critical observations, but if that was somebody in a seminary today, he'd just get laughed at. But later, in later times, you see verses 9 through 20 being called into question by guys like Griesbach back in the late 1700s or the 1800s. Westcott and Hort in 1881, they bracketed. In other words, they said, okay, we're going to keep it in our text. This was going to be a base text that would be influential with the revised version back in 1881. But when the revised standard version was published in the 1900s, they had Mark 16:9 through 20 in the margin, so they took it out of the text. Now the idea is, from their way of thinking, they're not taking out anything original; they're just not putting in this accretion which somehow got in there. That's the approach that a guy like, say, Dan Wallace would have. I think James White also is on record saying that he will not preach from Mark 16:9 through 20. Several other commentators, I think you could probably find their statements in the commentary, cautioning the reader against these verses. Some of the NIV's translators have said We just kept these verses in there so we wouldn't get boycotted by people that like the traditional text. So answering the question, should it be there or shouldn't it be there, is kind of an important question, simply to know what to do with these 12 verses. So that's an example of some of the more recent voices that have been out there claiming to reject the passage. I'd say Dan Wallace will be one, James White another one, and you could look through various commentators and probably find several others. But also, when you look at those commentaries, look and see how firm a grip they have on the relevant evidence, because you will also find in some of those commentaries mistakes about what the external evidence says, how clear the internal evidence is, and obviously a person who approaches the question with misinformation is not likely to reach a correct conclusion. So that's one of the things that we need to do, is to say how much information do we have that's accurate, how much information do we have that's inaccurate, and in some cases, how much information do we have that's simply information that is heavily nuanced by other information that's simply not mentioned. For instance, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, two important copies, both representing the text that was used in Egypt. Now, that doesn't mean they were made in Egypt. That's where the transmission line comes from. The Vaticanus and Sinaiticus both come into play in this question because of all the manuscripts we have in Greek, except for one medieval commentary manuscript. The only continuous text copies of Mark that we have, by continuous text, I mean it's titled, "This is the Gospel of Mark." It's not titled, "This is a commentary on Mark." Of all the manuscripts we have that have call themselves the Gospel of Mark, the only ones we have that don't have any trace of verses 9 through 20, the ones that end with a closing title at chapter 16, verse 8, are Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So now quantitatively, in terms of quantities, we have something like 1,640 copies that do include verses 9 through 20. The number of copies we have that don't include, in Greek, that don't include verses 9 through 20 are 2. Vaticanus.
Now, what is the oldest out of the 1,600? What is the oldest?
These are the oldest 2 copies. Yeah, Vaticanus comes from about 325 for Vaticanus, and I think that Sinaiticus probably comes from around 350, so one generation later. So these would be the oldest of all copies of Mark 16 that we have. These are the oldest 2 copies. But oftentimes, getting back to the point that I was making about having extra information, when we come to Vaticanus, oftentimes that's all you'll hear is that Vaticanus, our oldest copy, ends at verse 8. But it's important to see also in Codex Vaticanus, it ends at verse 8, but there's a blank column that follows. The rest of the column is blank. This is a 3-column book, so we have three columns. The middle column, it ends at about 2/3 of the page down. The rest of the column is blank except for the closing title. But then the copyist did something very unusual. He left the next column entirely blank. And when he's writing the New Testament, he never does that. In the Old Testament, there are a few blank spaces there, but there are reasons that can clearly be seen, contrary to something that Dan Wallace has claimed. It is not true that it's hard to see what caused those blank spaces in Codex Vaticanus. The factors that were involved in the production of the manuscript caused those, and they're very easy to point out. I've done so on my website a couple of times. But
now, let me ask you. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Finish your thought, and I will ask a question about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a blank column in Codex Sinaiticus that comes between Mark and Luke. The copyist in the New Testament never anywhere else puts a blank column between books. And here we see this blank column with this blank space underneath Mark 16:8. And when you take those 12 verses, using the copyist's own handwriting, with very little compression, which is something that the copyist knew how to do, you can fit verses 9 through 20 into the blank space. I've tried this myself and successfully completed. There's a picture online at my blog that shows verses 9 through 20 in Codex Vaticanus in that blank space. So it's not hard to look at Codex Vaticanus and say, there's a blank space here where usually you have these 12 verses. I wonder why the copyist made the blank space there. It's what's called the memorial space. We see this in some manuscripts where it comes to the story of the woman caught in adultery in John, where there's a blank space between the end of John 7:52 and the beginning of John 8:12. It's basically the copyist saying, my master copy that I was using didn't have this section, but I don't know if the person that I'm making this manuscript for is going to want it there or not. So I'll leave it blank so somebody else later on can make a decision. So it's kind of a copyist decision not to decide, but the thing to see is it shows an awareness of the passage. So yes, Vaticanus ends at 13:8, but by leaving that blank column, you don't have to be a telepath to realize the copyist was aware of the missing verses.
Correct, and that in of itself is an indication that why would you go through the this labor of leaving that space and the column, and it's an exact spot for fitting the writings, if it wasn't something that the person wasn't so sure yet what's going on here. So all that to say is we have a number of pictures, images. I think we'll be able to show them. Let's try one, for instance. Where would you like to go, and what point you like to point out of that image, for instance?
If you have image C or image B, you can see Vaticanus with the verses, and also the way it is in real life without the verses, side by side.
Now, was that it's called which one? It's called. I'm sorry, so I can find it.
Image B.
All right, so let's
Codex Vaticanus, Mark 16, side by side.
All right, let me go there. And you called it image C?
B, like Bumblebee.
Okay.
C will work too.
Yeah, I'm trying to find your notations right now.
Codex Vaticanus, Mark 16, side by side is the full name.
Okay, here you go. So I'm gonna do this right now, and let's see if we can show it. Share. Can everybody see it? Can you see it?
I see it. Okay, there on the left is the manuscript as it appears. No, if you go to the Vaticanus Library's website, that's the page as you would see it there on the left, with that blank column in Vaticanus after the verse 8 as the last line of text, and then you have the Catamarcon. That's the closing title. But in that blank space that follows chapter 16, verse 8, there on the right is the reconstruction. Using the copyist's own handwriting, each one of these letters in the reconstruction, I cut and paste digitally from elsewhere on the same page of the manuscript. And there you see verses 16, 9 through 20, very snugly fit in the blank space. Now, this lettering is compressed. So if you were to write at the normal rate, you would have between 2 and 4 lines longer, depending on how compressed you put it. But the copyists knew how to compress their letters, and so that's not a big objection. We see a compression, for instance, in Sinaiticus on the opening pages of Luke, which we'll get to hopefully next.
Well, let me ask this, brother. It seemed like on the image on the left side, at least the way I'm looking at it right now as a viewer, the writing is almost like faded. Was it there and it's faded, or it's made to look as if we fit it in there would look like this for now at least?
Well, the writing is cut and pasted, so that's entirely artificial. That's all digitally made.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
The letters themselves are from elsewhere on the page.
But I mean, it's amazing, because if you didn't say that, I would have assumed it's part of the writing. It's fitting fine. There isn't anything suspicious about it.
Yeah, I think it fits pretty snugly there. Even in verse 18, the phrase "and in their hands," I just added in there, so you could shorten the text a little bit to a shorter form, and it would fit even better with less compression. But there you can see verses 9 through 20 will fit on the page without difficulty.
Very good. So what other image you would like for me to go to? I'm going to stop sharing this one.
Well, we have claims that are floating out there in commentaries. For instance, Norman Geisler claimed that verses 9 through 20 are lacking in many of the most reliable manuscripts, many of the oldest manuscripts. Larry Richards, one of his books, says that they're lacking in many ancient manuscripts. Jim Levitt, Harrington, Jewell, Finley Scott, David Ewart says all major manuscripts in this gospel of 16:8. So just to kind of show how wrong they are, if we could put up a Codex A, and you can see Codex Alexandrinus unquestionably displays very clearly.
Okay, I'm going to go there. Okay.
Codex A, Mark 16:9.
I'll go there right now.
Just to clear up who's talking nonsense about manuscripts by the boatload not having this passage. Can we see the manuscripts, please? No, because it's easy to make that claim in the commentary, but when you actually consult the manuscripts, there's the passage. Codex Alexandrinus has the passage. It starts out with you can see the usual bold initial and Codex Alexandrinus. And if you wait just a moment while that comes up.
Yeah, okay, so here you go. Go ahead.
Codex Alexandrinus, often referred to as one of the big three. It's just in terms of size, it's simply one of the bigger manuscripts, along with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. You can see the writing is very clear. I've enlarged the text that's in the box. That's enlarged up at the top. And there's verse 8. And following that is verse 9. So that should hopefully clear things up when somebody says it's not in a lot of manuscripts. Yes, it is. Show me the manuscripts the way you don't think it is that are in Greek. And they will be hard pressed, because the only ones that don't have verses 9 through 20 that have chapter 16, verse 8 are Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and 304. That's it. That's the only manuscripts they can appeal to that say it stops here.
We know, I mean, Norm Geisler is a brother in the Lord, and I'm not, I can't say he was misleading people. Do you think at the time when he made that statement, there wasn't enough evidence, for instance, or discoveries, or was he just being skeptic and not buying into the evidence yet?
Well, Norman Geisler was severely misinformed and severely oversimplified this particular point. I think that one of the things that happened was he read Bruce Metzger's textual comments on the same passage, but he kind of blurred them. Sometimes when a person remembers things, you don't remember them quite accurately. And he used one of Bruce Metzger's comments where Bruce Metzger mentioned 2 manuscripts. Geisler used the same comment before and after, but instead of 2, he put in the word many. So I'm not sure how defensible some of Norman Geisler's statements would be. Now, of course, Brother Geisler is now, unfortunately, incapable of correcting his work. But that doesn't mean that we can't, when it comes to his work, put in a little note that says this isn't exactly very accurate at all. I have a video on YouTube about how some of the commentators are like parrots, and that's simply meant as a realistic way of assessing the value of their work when they're just repeating what they've been told and adding a little bit to it out of the blue as they do so. Well, guys like N.T. Wright do the same kind of thing. And
right.
So
I want to just, here is a comment. Smidley, thank you so much, by the way, for the super chat. Smidley is saying maybe the oldest manuscripts are still around because they weren't used since they left out Mark's ending. I hope so. I mean, hopefully we will discover them at some point and put an end to this basically back and forth. But before I even dig deeper into this with you right now, one thing we need to make sure, brother, we address. Do you feel, I mean, I'm asking you as the scholar right now, I don't want to interject my own thought. Do you believe or do you feel that just because that ending wasn't there, for instance, and what was added, if we take it out just right now, is it going to impact our faith in any way? Is it going to impact our essential doctrines? Does it have any change to the story of the gospel?
It's kind of a how much can we get away with kind of question. I'm not sure. I don't know everybody's situation, so I don't know how much they might be depending on this passage. I don't want to say none of these textual variants matter because, well, let's just pick the worst one we can possibly find then. So I think that the question that we should focus on is, does this passage belong there, or does it not belong there? And then we can go from there to say, well, how much can we get away with misunderstanding or misinterpreting? But I tend to shy away from the question of how much can I get away with. I'd rather like to say, what is the original text?
Yeah, but I mean, I guess my question, let me rephrase it. If I don't have the ending of Mark, does that mean the gospel really changed in any way?
The gospel hasn't changed, but you could also say a person could argue, as I mentioned earlier, a person could possibly think, now I don't think this would be a valid approach, but a person could convince themselves or himself that, well, the ending of the Gospel of Mark is a forgery, therefore we can't really trust the text. If all these manuscripts have it, how can we trust the transmission line itself if all of them have been so deceived that this got in there for so long and so widely distributed in the text?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. And obviously, yes, if you want to think about the transmission, that's a whole different story. But the message itself hasn't been impacted. And in other words, if we want to also trust the transmission, that's a whole different ballgame. We have to look at other evidence and transmission and manuscript evidence and so on and so forth. But you're right. I mean, if somebody wants to convince himself of this, of course, the wild imagination can go as far as they want it.
I think if you go into the Biblical Archaeology Review website and look at James Tabor's treatment of the passage, it's got a certain nuance that's hard to call scholarly. The way he says, well, it's a forgery, man. It's a forgery, and you've got to reject this. It's obvious some forger came in and made this up, and it's very, very slanted toward, therefore, you shouldn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Of course, James Tabor rejected Mark 16:9-20 and went on to reject a physical resurrection. So there's one case where I think a person could argue that there's a connection between this textual question and how a person ends up with his view of the nature of Jesus' resurrection. James Tabor, if I recall correctly, believes that Jesus' resurrection was a spiritual resurrection, and his later appearances were just that, appearances, but not a bodily, in the flesh, eating kind of resurrection. So there is one example I would be very hesitant to say, no, it doesn't make any difference, because clearly I think in Tabor's case, it has made a difference. Now, as far as whether Tabor's approach is valid, that's also a question, but that's a different aspect of the situation.
All right. Thank you, brother. I just wanted, I like to explore all of these possibilities out there, but certainly I can speak for myself. Something like this doesn't shake my faith, doesn't change my belief in the gospel. I am confident that we have enough evidence to support the Bible that we have in our hand today. But we know there are people out there that would want to convince themselves otherwise, or even buy into misinformation one way or another. Sorry, go ahead.
The way you put it there would be a good way to put it, that if a person wants to convince himself that the gospel is not valid, this would be one thing that could be used in that direction. Other things could be used too. But also conversely, to the person who believes the gospel because he's been called by God, and his name's in the book of life, none of these things are going to be insuperable obstacles for the Holy Spirit to call that person. So I think that's pretty obvious to everybody.
Amen. And the beauty, brother, about what we're doing is that we're not really intimidated by pointing out things in our Bible based on manuscript evidence, discussing it, not really afraid of doing that. Where I came from, my background, it was a taboo to talk about anything that impact the Quran. And we know now what's going on. I mean, since June of this year, one of the Islamic scholars made a comment that there is holes in the narrative of the early narrative of the collection of the Quran, and it caused an uproar, and they had to delete their interview, and I mean, which is pretty sad really when you think about it. Here we are enjoying our day, talking about things that are powerful, no doubt about it, but we're not really shaken by it. And the reason why our Muslim friends, by the way, know about this issue is that our scholars put footnotes for them in our own Bible, making indications of things like this. So it's not like a hidden thing and someone discovered it. It's out in the open, and there is nothing really for us to be afraid about discussing.
Hopefully, with the information that people get today, they'll be better equipped to interpret those footnotes. Not all of those footnotes are accurate, and most of them are very vague. For instance, when the ESV first came out, a person reading the ESV's footnote would think, well, there must be several manuscripts out there that have the Philologion. Not now, the footnote has been corrected. It says at least one manuscript has the Philologion. But why not put just one? Because that's all there are. It's just in Codex W. We don't have the manuscripts that Jerome mentioned that had it. So some of these footnotes really need adjustment. I would definitely tell the footnote writers that it's okay to say more than some manuscripts have it and some manuscripts don't, when the score, if you were keeping score, would be 2 versus 1,600. Or if you were to go back to, say, the year 500 as a cutoff point and say we have 40 patristic references that use Mark 16:9-20, and how many patristic references say the text ends at 16:8? Eusebius says that's something that somebody could say, and Jerome echoes Eusebius, but does Eusebius also quote Mark 16:9? Yes, he does. And does Jerome have Mark 16:9-20 in the Vulgate? Yes, he does. So those things all need to be taken into consideration, and the footnotes can definitely be improved, especially in the paraphrase that's known as, or the hyper paraphrase known as the Message. His footnote says that only later manuscripts include Mark 16:9-20. I just showed you Codex Alexandrinus, and we could also see Codex C. I think we have that handy among my images.
Yeah, I'll go there right now. But I want to comment on what you're saying. I mean, it seems to me, and I hate to say this, but sometimes you have to really bring it up. There are some theologies out there that like to creep in, usually. And I want to leave it like that without labeling anyone. And sadly, since, at least the age of enlightenment, we've been seeing these attacks intensify against the Bible. All that to say, to be honest with you, it is those kind of attacks in the last 200 years that helped someone like me, a wretched man like me, to come to Christ, because I studied all of them and I was buying into them and I believed in them. And then all of a sudden I realized that, you know what? None of it is true, and the Bible is the Word of God, and Jesus is the only way. So it actually helped me. Why? Because I flushed out all of the doubts through these kind of attacks, rather than to get shocked later and realize, oops, I didn't know this. I didn't hear about it. So sometimes it's actually helpful to go through all of that. You want me to go to image or Codex C, you said?
If you can see Codex C, just as we have it under image E, Codex C shows the page on which Mark has Mark 16, 14-20.
Very good. Why don't you go ahead and continue with your talk while I look for it right now?
Okay. Well, this is Codex C, and it's what's called a palimpsest, which means that its parchment has been recycled. Somebody later on, after Codex C was produced, needed some parchment, and they thought, let's use some parchment that we have on hand that we don't need anymore. We don't know if they just simply couldn't read Greek anymore. But for some reason, they took pages of Codex C and rewrote the sermons of Ephraim, the Syrian patristic writer, on top of them. So here you see how Codex C looks today. The later writing is on top of the older writing, and the older writing is the last part of Mark. So,
and by the way, folks, this is called palimpsest. That's the process. You wash it off or you erase it and you write on top of it. In fact, this is found at BNF, which is in France, and I've been studying some manuscripts there from the Quran that have the same kind of status as well. Go ahead, brother.
Yes, you can see that the Greek letters are there behind the letters in front. So, but now if you see a Codex C, do you have the augmented scribe you can pull up now that we've seen Codex C with the upper writing on it?
Yeah, can you see it?
I see the page that has the upper writing on it, but there's another one called Codex C, Mark 16, 14-20, that's augmented. So the upper writing has been digitally removed.
Okay. Yeah, I'll find it right now. So let me stop sharing here, and then we'll find the next one. So I'll let you know right now. Here you go. I think this is the one. Yes, and I am gonna share it again. Okay. So the first one showed the upper layer. Now we want to show maybe another part of that. So there you go.
It's the same page with the upper writing removed digitally, and there you see Mark 16, 14-20. In case anybody has any doubt, if anybody believes the footnotes that say, well, the early manuscripts don't have these verses. Well, there's Codex C, and there you can see the text of Mark 16, 14 through 20. And if you had the page before it, you'd see the rest of the ending of Mark. So
and I want to add to what our brother is saying here. And I know, folks, you cannot see me talking right now, but we want you to see the image. What my brother is saying here is that there is technology these days where you can dim off, if you want, or digitally remove the lower layer so that you can clearly see the upper layer, or the vice versa. I mean, I'm studying manuscripts of the Quran where you can see the lower layer clearer than the upper layer. So here, when you look at that particular writing of Mark, you can see the end of Mark right there. I guess the question we can ask ourselves, why would anyone go through the trouble of writing the end of Mark if it wasn't actually something that was in circulation?
Yes, and to clarify the idea that it was circulation, you can also look at Codex W. Now, in Codex W, it's a very interesting manuscript because its form of the text varies. There are different forms of the text they circulated from certain centers. And
we have an image of it, right?
Yeah. So we have Codex W, Codex W Mark 16. That's image letter H.
Okay. I will go there right now.
And this one is interesting, not just because Codex W is block mixed. Its type of text varies from one part to another. In Matthew, it's very Byzantine, very Byzantine. But here at the end of Mark, we see Mark 16, 9 through 20. But after verse 14, we see what's called the Phreologion. This is an interpolation that Jerome mentioned. So we know that it goes back as far as Jerome. And here you see there that yellow, if you see on the left, that's where Mark 16:9 begins. And it ends, of course, at the end of the text. But there in the middle, between those two green arrows, somebody has added in, not necessarily just in this manuscript, but added into the text somewhere along the line, an interpolation about where the apostles try to excuse themselves. They say that this is because of all the evil things that Satan has done, and that though ends after that second arrow, and there you have then verses 15 through 20 after it. So sometimes Codex W is presented as another ending, but as you can plainly see, this is the same 12 verses. It just has the extra material between verse 14 and verse 15. So that's Codex W. Codex W is also interesting because of where it came from. It's not from Europe. This is a manuscript with what's understood to be an Egyptian provenance, and its text type changes from one part of the Gospels to another. And I think some researchers have thought, well, maybe, just maybe, somewhere along the line, somebody had some copies of the Gospels that the Romans had destroyed, because that's what Romans did with manuscripts of Christians in some of the persecutions, in the Decian persecution, the Diocletian persecution. Scriptures were targeted, and somebody thinks, well, maybe somebody took a copy or several copies that had been targeted and salvaged them by taking a piece of this one and a piece of this one and a piece of this one and putting it together. So now, as far as production date of Codex W, the date is 400, which is pretty early, but the text itself could go back to the time of persecution, and that would explain to some extent why it varies in this way from one part to another. So that's Codex W, which has verses 9 through 20. So we've seen Codex A, we've seen Codex C, we've seen Codex W. I think we can dispense with the claim that most of the early manuscripts don't have it. So that's just a part of the real world that needs to be introduced to these commentators that say, hardly any of the old manuscripts have these verses, because in real life, why do you
think this narrative, this agenda, keeps always seeping into seminaries and other places? I mean, like I said, I was disturbed when one of my own professors says, well, I wouldn't preach from it. And I'm telling myself, no, I would preach from it. Why wouldn't I? I mean, it's right there in my Bible.
Well, part of it, and you can still see this in commentaries that are being made today, that were made last year, is simply the use of obsolete resources. Some of the text critical resources that people use are the old dusty books that you walk by in your theological libraries that nobody else has touched because they don't think they need to. But they'll find an old commentary and say, oh, this is an old book, it must be very useful. And so they'll get it, and it will be useful, but it will also have information that's, as far as the writer of that book wrote, and they'll just pass that along without double checking it. There's an enormous problem in academia of people not checking their manuscripts. I think Dean Bergen was complaining about that way back in the 1870s. Double check your references, but nobody does. To this day, you can get a copy of the King James Only Controversy by James White, and you'll find a statement that says some Ethiopic manuscripts don't have verses 9 through 20. Well, it was 1980. 1980. We're talking 1980, where Bruce Metzger said, I said that myself a while back, and then I decided to double check my reference. So when I did and looked at the Ethiopic manuscripts, you know what I found? I found that everybody for the past 80 years or so has been misunderstanding a little abbreviation by a previous scholar. In real life, all the Ethiopic copies of Mark include verses 9 through 20. Some of them have the shorter ending after verse 8, but they go on to have verses 9 through 20. That claim about some Ethiopic manuscripts not having verses 9 through 20 has circulated not only in James White's books, but also Eugene Nida, a very influential writer with translation work. He yeasted the comment a little bit, said, it wasn't just any Ethiopic copies, it was important Ethiopic copies. But the claim is bogus. The claim is a phantom. Not only is it a phantom, but it's a phantom that Bruce Metzger retracted back in 1980, and here we are in 2020, and people are still making the same claim. James White, Matt Slick, fix your books. Isn't it about time? He withdrew the claim in 1980. So that's one reason that these
thanks, brother,
because trusted sources don't check the references.
Yeah, thank you for your honesty and sharing this. I agree with you. What else? When in the time remaining, we have about maybe 15, 20 minutes. Are there any other images you feel like we should share him as well?
Yes, we should probably cover the shorter ending, definitely. If you look at image L, it has Codex Babiensis.
Okay, I'll go there right now.
An old Latin manuscript. Now again, some commentators, for instance, James Edwards, his commentary, he claims the old Latin version omits Mark 16, 9 through 20. Well, this is the one manuscript that's old Latin where we can clearly see the omission of verses 9 through 20. All the other old Latin that we can tell include it. So that's, I think, one statement that gets a lot of circulation that should definitely be clarified. This is the one and only one old Latin manuscript in which the text...
So we're saying Codex L? Codex L as in Lumen?
Codex Babiensis.
Oh, okay. I'll go there right now. Yes, I just saw it. Yeah, I'll go back to...
Okay. The thing you're talking about, Babiensis was made by a particularly inept scribe, and I don't mean that subjectively, I mean that objectively. He was a very challenged scribe. He made all kinds of mistakes. He called Peter, if you look at this page here, this is the shorter ending as found in Codex Babiensis. In verse 8, he cuts off the last bit. The idea is that...
If you don't mind me stopping you here, I'm just thinking like my viewers. What is the age of this codex?
This is from about the year 425, and it's really hard to precise. Now, you always understand when you say 425 or anything like that. This is a paleographically arrived at date, so throw in 50 years in both directions, because you never know when you see a manuscript how old the scribe was. He might be an old guy who's about to die, and he's been making copies for 50 years, or he might be a young guy. He's going to go on making copies for another 50 years. So to account for what we don't know, it's best to just assume 50 years either way and just live with that wiggle room. So in Codex L, in Codex K, Codex Babiensis, you can see the shorter ending, and you can see one of the mistakes that he made. This wood down at the bottom, that's a later hand, or perhaps his own hand of putting in something that was left out. But that's the shorter ending, and it's also in Codex L in Greek. If you have Codex L there for the image, this is the old Latin Codex Babiensis. But also in Codex L, if you have Codex L Mark 16 with the SE, I think,
yes,
the notation.
Yeah, I will go there right now. Codex L, yes, I have it right here, and we will show it. So there you go. This is Codex L.
Again, the footnotes will sometimes say, well, some copies end at the end of verse 8. Well, that's those two I mentioned, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus. And we shouldn't remind me to go back to Sinaiticus because it's got anomalies in it too, as well as like Vaticanus did, but a different kind. Here we have Codex L ends at verse 8, and at the end of that first column, there at the top of the second column, we have this also appears. And then we have the shorter ending. And then you have the little note that's kind of in the little dots, kind of a frame around it. That note says, no, we also have some copies that have this after Ephobanto Gar, that is after the words that appear at the end of verse 8 there. And there you have in the colorful letters there at the lower right, the beginning of chapter 16, verse 9. So in Codex L, this comes from a particular locale where the shorter ending is circulating along with the usual 12 verses. And the question comes up, well, why was the shorter ending there if the longer ending of verses 9 to 20 were already there? And the idea is obviously, well, it wasn't. And so the shorter ending is mentioned, even though it's extant, it's in the Greek manuscripts, and only 6 Greek manuscripts. So again, not to make textual decisions by number, but to give you some idea of the scale of the support for Mark 16, 9 to 20, abrupt ending at verse 8, 2 manuscripts. The shorter ending, 6 manuscripts, one of which just has the shorter ending in the margin, and the other 1,600 and so have verses 9 to 20. Codex L has the shorter ending and verses 9 to 20, and here we see the shorter ending precede this note, and the notes are significant because the same notes, or very similar notes, appear in some of the other manuscripts that have the shorter ending. In other words, the manuscripts that have the shorter ending are not just somebody randomly making the observation independently. When we look at the Greek manuscripts that have the shorter ending, that we can pretty much discern a provenance for them from Egypt. We see these notes circulating. So it's not like we just have this shorter ending at random, but we also have the notes show up. And the notes that show up before the shorter ending and before verse 9 also show up in the Egyptian Sahidic lectionary 1602. So there we have a location pinned down of where the shorter ending was circulating. It was circulating in Egypt. Everywhere else we see verses 9 through 20. We don't even see the shorter ending. Eusebius, in his what he says to Marinus, Eusebius doesn't mention the shorter ending when people are asking him specifically about the ending of Mark. He doesn't mention the shorter ending, probably because he has no idea that it exists, because its circulation is so limited. But there in Egypt, the shorter ending was there for a while without verses 9 to 20. That's what is reflected by the Old Latin Codex Babiensis. So if you kind of put 2 and 2 together, you can see that at some point in Egypt, Mark circulated without verses 9 to 20. Somebody just can't stand it and says, it can't end there. We got to finish this book. We got to round things off. Makes the shorter ending. And for a while in Egypt, in that particular place, in that particular time, that's how they ended Mark. Now, it didn't get very far. It didn't last very long until they realized, oh, there is this other 12-verse ending that everybody else is using. And so they put that on too. But there in Egypt, you have a situation where you have the shorter ending, which implies that before that, you had a situation where it ended at verse 8. So that's the importance of the manuscripts that have the shorter ending. I don't think anybody thinks the shorter ending is anywhere remotely close to being original, but it's there as a kind of a place filler, or as a flourish to round off the book. And then when verses 9 through 20 arrive, a few guys keep it going, and then it just dies out. Meanwhile, in the Ethiopic and in the Baharic, there you see it where it's like, well, if it's there, it's there. We'll just throw them both in. And you see a lot of Ethiopic manuscripts that have both endings. Not they have some with it and some without, but you have lots of manuscripts where they're both there. So that raises the question of, well, if you look back far enough, the text in Egypt appears to have circulated for a while without verses 9 through 20. And then until somebody came along and said, I can't stand it anymore, we got to make an ending, and they made the shorter ending. So we're looking back, that raises the question of, well, if that's what's reflected in Vaticanus, what is there before that? And that's where the patristic evidence comes into play. In the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are 2 early manuscripts from the 300s. They're fairly early, but Irenaeus is much earlier. Irenaeus wrote in the 180s. Irenaeus visited Rome. He grew up in Asia Minor. So this is a man who has a wide ranging physically awareness of what's out there. He quoted from Mark 16, 9 through 20. If you have a GA 1582.
Okay, I'll go there right now. Keep going.
Irenaeus in book 3 of Against Heresies quoted from Mark 16, 19. Now, most of Against Heresies we only have in most of this book, at least, in Latin. That's a very wooden translation. You say ultra little, maybe. But Irenaeus, when he's quoting from Mark 16, he quotes this verse, and a later writer in one of the same manuscripts that has a note after verse 8 that says, not all manuscripts have this, also have this note in manuscript 1582, where it says, Irenaeus, who lived close to the apostles, quoted from this passage in book 3 of Against Heresies. So here's a copyist, and this note appears in more than one manuscript. It appears in at least 3, in 1582 and in 72, and another one that I think is almost ready to be cataloged or has recently been cataloged. But there's Mark 16 in the text. 16.
So, is it fair to say that aside from just manuscripts, at least by way of quotations, this could be one of the earliest evidence that someone quoted it?
Yes. Irenaeus is 180, and you can't get much earlier than that. I mean, before that, you have Justin Martyr and a few other writers like Barnabas and Hermas. Diogenes is there, the Epistle of Diogenes. But as far as the subject at hand is concerned, when it comes to quotations from Mark 16:19 is one of the earliest verses of Mark that we see clearly quoted anywhere. So there is Mark 16:19 in the text, and then there in that note on the right that kind of ends in a triangular shape, there you see the note that mentions Irenaeus, who lived close to the apostles, in book 3 of his book Against Heresies, used this passage. So Irenaeus,
exactly, and why would he quote something that is not even part of the gospel? I mean, that will shoot into his own reputation if that's the case.
Yes, it raises a question of that's a very good question, and that's if you had footnotes that mentioned Irenaeus' testimony from the year 180, more than a century before our earliest manuscript of Mark 16, the passage would probably not be doubted nearly as much as it is. But you don't have that kind of footnote. You also don't have footnotes that mention Justin Martyr in chapter 45 of his First Apologies. This is a little bit earlier than Irenaeus. Justin Martyr uses some of the same phraseology that we see in Mark 16:20. Also in Mark in chapter 50 of First Apology, Mark seems to use a form of the text of Mark 16:14 that is very similar to what he has there in his First Apology. Also Tatian, this is around the year 170. Tatian in his Diatessaron uses Mark 16:9-20. Now there was a question back in the 1880s when the revised text was made. We don't really know the testimony of Tatian. And in 1888, 7 years later, the Arabic Diatessaron became more accessible. It had kind of been available, but you had no Armenian. When the Arabic Diatessaron became available, and people could read it and say, well, this most definitely includes verses 9 through 20. But you can even go beyond that and say, not only does the Arabic Diatessaron include it, that's an Eastern branch of Diatesseronic witnesses. Let's look into the Western branch. Well, there we have Codex Valdensis, and when you line them up, you can see that the format, the arrangement of the text corresponds to a great degree between Codex Valdensis in the 500s and the Arabic. So you have those two branches of the tree, so to speak, telling us, yes, we see the same arrangement for the Diatessaron in Valdensis and in the Arabic.
Now, I want to just say something to people as well, lay persons and others. When we say Diatessaron, we're talking about the harmony of the 4 Gospels. Someone basically took the time to take all 4 Gospels and make like one story out of them. So that's why it's significant, because he did mention also the ending of Mark in there.
Yes, and the Diatessaron was still around in the 400s.
And the person who did it, his name is Tatian, by the way, folks, in case you're wondering.
Yes, Tatian. And so in his combination of all 4 Gospels, in his copies, he includes Mark 16:9-20. So at least that was in the copies that were available, they were used by Tatian. Then if we look at Codex 042, it ends at, there was a simple typo in some of Metzger's work. He says that Codex 042 that Mark ends at 14:14. It doesn't. It ends at 16:14. So now, if you're using Roman numerals, you can see how the mistake was made. But it is a mistake. So,
right.
So if you have a copy of Metzger's book where Metzger says 14 instead of 16, it should be chapter 16, verse 14. And I believe that manuscript can be found, collations if it can be found online to verify that. Also, you have what's called the Epistula Apostolorum. This is not a well-known composition, but the Epistula Apostolorum, and it wasn't known to Westcott and Hort, so you can't blame Hort for not knowing what he couldn't know. But the Epistula Apostolorum uses some of the same narrative flow that we see in the ending of the Gospel of Mark, but where, for instance, we see that not only does a woman come from the empty tomb saying she's seen an angel, but she comes from the empty tomb saying, Jesus appeared to me. Well, what do you get that from? Well, you get that from here in Mark. Also, you have the claim also often goes forth that Clement of Alexandria and Origen don't show any awareness of these 12 verses. And the implication that the reader, I think, is expected to draw from that is, oh, well, that means it wasn't in the manuscripts, right? But when you look into how much did Clement of Alexandria use the Gospel of Mark at all, did he ever use, did we ever see any clear specific quotation from Clement from chapter 1, from chapter 2, from chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 11, 12, 15, and 16? What we have here is just a symptom of how rarely Clement used the Gospel of Mark. He uses a lot of chapter 10, but get out of chapter 10 and he hardly ever uses it at all. But readers that don't know that, this is one example of where you see information, but you don't see the other relevant information, and you can get an entirely wrong, messed up picture of what does that particular data mean. Similarly, when you have the internal evidence and you have, well, Mark doesn't know, he's not aware of 18 words that we see in verses 9-20. Okay, could you please provide the information, Mr. Commentator, of how many 12-verse passages of Mark typically have once used words and how many there are? Can we see a baseline to work with? Can we see a baseline of comparison? Because obviously, any writer uses a word uniquely once in a while. How many times does Mark use unique words? When you realize that in Mark 15, verse 40 through 16:4, Mark has even more once used words, does that previous bit of information really matter a whole lot? When you look at individual 12-verse segments of Mark, and work was done recently on this by somebody else, the amount of once used words in 12-verse sections of Mark 16:9-20 doesn't even rank in the top 8. I think it's somewhere down the list of like of all 12-verse sections that have once used words. If it was a contest, Mark 16:9-20 wouldn't make the podium. It's down in like 9th or 10th. May tied for 10th or tied for 9th. Also, when you have a Jerome, the guy that made the Vulgate, when he's making the Vulgate, he says, I only used, or he says, I used ancient Greek manuscripts as the basis for this version. And there we see in the Vulgate, plain as day, verses 9-20.
And then, by the way, the Vulgate, folks, is the Latin translation of the Bible.
Yes.
Just to
let you know. That was made in about the year 383, the Gospels anyway. So also we have Jerome later on in his career, around the year 417, when he's writing in against the Pelagians, he refers to the same passage that we saw before in Codex W, the Phreologion, and he says, in certain exemplars, especially in Greek codices near the end of the Gospel of Mark, and then he says, I saw this, and he prefaces it with verse 14, expecting that his readers are going to know what he's talking about. But we see lots of other sources, lots of other patristic references. Hippolytus, what's called the Didascalia Apostolorum, Vincentius at a church council, the work called De Re Baptismate. Also, a non-Christian writer named Hierocles, who is one of the students of the famous anti-Christian named Porphyry. In one of his books, he kind of makes a little jab at the Christian, a little jibe, saying, if you guys get into discussions about who should be leading the church, why don't you just have a poison drinking contest where, you know, the one with the most faith is the one who should be able to drink the most poison, right? Is that what your book says? I mean, it says that other detail in the other passage where, and if I can just read a little bit from, this is an important witness that I don't think it gets a lot of attention. But Hierocles says, consider in detail that other passage where he says, such signs shall follow them that believe. They shall lay hands upon sick folk, and they shall recover. And if they drink any deadly drug, it shall in no wise hurt them. So the right thing to do would be for those selected for the priesthood, and particularly those who lay claim to the bishop's office, to make use of this form of test. So you can see that in Porphyry's text, the text of the unbeliever, he had Mark 16, 9 through 20. Also, Aphra had, around the year 336. So this would be older than Sinaiticus. Aphra had around 336, who's probably a writer who knows the Diatessaron. He, in his first demonstration on faith, he quotes, "This shall be the sign for those who believe. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall cast out demons. They shall place their hands on the sick, and they shall be made whole." Now, it's not an exact quotation, but you can clearly see the text that he's using has Mark 16, that part, which implies the rest.
I think I want to just remind people that every single evidence our brother is sharing here shows that there is authenticity to including the ending of Mark. Some of it date all the way back to the days of Irenaeus. And these are important figures that he's mentioning. So he's making a case for it, basically. That's what he's trying to do. And we have a question for you before we end, by the way, brother. So go ahead. Please continue with your evidence. I'm sorry. I
thought we had a question. And
I'll ask you a question later. Yes.
Go on. There's a whole lot of external evidence, but I don't want to let the internal evidence slide by either. So remind me of that as we get close to wrapping up. But there was a writer named Fortunatianus, and his commentary was recently, very, very recently. I mean, it's like might still be printing. Well, no, it's been published. But anyway, Fortunatianus, in his commentary, he says that Mark mentions Jesus' ascension. Also, the book called Acts of Pilate, sometimes also called the Gospel of Nicodemus. It's a piece of pseudepigraphy, but it's a piece of pseudepigraphy that borrowed lots of quotations from the Gospels. And in that, Mark 16, 15 through 16 is used as part of the narrative. And in a later form of it, even more of Mark 16, 17 through 18 is used. But definitely in the earliest form of it, there's Mark 16, 15 through 16 used. Also, there was this little city called Milan, where there was this bishop, very, very obscure guy named Ambrose. And he quotes Mark 16, 9 through 20 over and over and over in prayer of Job and David and concerning repentance and of the Holy Spirit. Clearly, not only does Jerome quote it, but if there was any question about it, he would have brought it up, you would think. And Ambrose had read, like I mentioned before, had read Eusebius' earlier work, but Ambrose clearly uses Mark 16, 9 through 20 up and down. Also, Ephraim Cyrus wrote an important commentary on the Diatessaron.
What year is that? Sometimes years are helpful for people to see.
Ephraim Cyrus wrote around the 360s or so, and then died.
Okay.
And but the writing in which his commentary is best known for these days is a manuscript called Chester Beatty Syriac Manuscript 709, and that was produced.
Chester Beatty, yeah.
Chester Beatty Syriac Manuscript 709, produced around the year 500. So it's like, not only is this an old patristic writer, but the copy in which his writings are preserved is also old. And Ephraim mentions in his commentary that after Jesus' crucifixion, he commanded his disciples, go out into the whole world. Oh, where do we see that phrase? And proclaim my gospel to the whole of creation. Again, this is, it doesn't take a whole lot of thought to say, he's using Mark 16, 15 through 16. And baptize all the Gentiles. So there you have Ephraim Cyrus, a very influential writer and poet. Also in the book called Apostolic Constitutions, which is kind of a composite work. It took earlier compositions and just kind of slapped them all in one piece. In Apostolic Constitutions, Mark 16, 9 through 20 is also used. Also, Augustine, this another obscure writer who would somewhere in Africa. I think he had a pet hippo. No, but this Augustine guy, he quotes Mark 16:9-20 repeatedly, but also in one of his comments he mentions his Greek manuscripts. Now, Augustine is often known as a Greek writer who dabbled in Greek, but he in this case, when he's talking in his Harmony of the Gospels, he mentions that when he quotes Mark 16:12 and says, in the Greek codices, indeed, the reading that we discover is estate rather than country seat. So Eusebius is quoting from his Greek manuscripts at that point. So that's not just his Latin text, but he has Greek manuscripts on hand there in Africa, in North Africa, that have Mark 16:9-20. Epiphanius is somewhere else. He's on an island somewhere of Cyprus. And Ephraim wrote in his book called Panarion, a medicine chest, as the Gospel of Mark and the other evangelists put it, he ascended up to heaven and sits on the right hand of the Father. So Epiphanius' copy of Mark mentioned that Jesus had ascended up to heaven, and you don't see that until you get to Mark 16:19.
That's right.
Also, what are called Old Latin chapter summaries. Some of the old Latin copies, once the Vulgate came along and people wanted to standardize things, the old Latin text slowly died out, in some cases quicker than others. But there was no rule about what goes along with the text, and so all the study guides and helps, oftentimes we find those included even in later copies of the Vulgate, because they just liked the old Latin form of it that they had. For instance, vocabulary lists and chapter summaries. Well, in the Old Latin chapter summaries of Mark, chapter 47 is summed up as, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to the apostles and said, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, the unbeliever shall be damned, and the Lord was received into heaven. So you can see in the Old Latin chapter summaries, they also had Mark 16:9-20. That the quotation I just read reflects or echoes Mark 16:16. Also, the what we call the Lucian Acts, which is not really a good thing to follow or for doctrine, but it's also too new verses 9-20. So when we see across the spectrum of complete unbelievers like Hierocles, not so orthodox like Lucian Acts, but also pillars of the church like Ambrose and Augustine and Jerome, these guys are also using Mark 16:9-20. Macarius Magnes, the guy that responded to Hierocles, he didn't know who he was responding to, but Macarius Magnes also accepts the passage when it was a golden opportunity to say, "Oh, that's not in the manuscript, so you're giving a superfluous objection." Macarius Magnes, though, accepted the passage and gave a different answer, showing that he had the verse in the passage in his text. Also, you can look at passages like the Doctrine of Addai, Pelagius, the writings of Philostorgius, and Philostorgius has an interesting anecdote. He mentions a story that he attributes to the anonymous Homonian. I'm kind of getting into the tall grass here, but the anecdote is there was this Christian named Eugenius who was challenged by a Jewish person to eat a dead snake, and he did so immediately. No, I'm not recommending to go eat dead snakes or anything like that, but the story is that he just reports. The author states, thus there was fulfilled with them so the salvation-bringing gospel, saying, and they will pick up snakes with their hands, and if they eat anything deadly, it will not hurt them. So that's just a little snippet from a Philostorgius that shows the person that wrote that knew Mark 16:9-20 and regarded it as part of the gospel.
Wonderful.
Also, all the way over in Armenia, Armenian copies are sometimes pointed out as lots of Armenian copies don't have verses 9-20. They end at verse 8. Now, keeping in mind that all Armenian copies generally, they come down the same slide. So it's what's at the top of the slide is what you look at. But one of the translators of the Armenian version was a guy named Esnik of Gold, and he took part in the revision of the Gospels text that they began with Maschotz there in the early 400s. Eusebius, around the year 440, in his composition Against the Sects, also called Dideo, says, and again, when he's trying to back himself up with some scriptures, time out.
Yeah, and I think we have a few minutes left, brother, just to help you wrap up your thoughts as well.
Okay. Esnick says, now again, 450 is the latest date of composition here. And again, here are signs of believers. They will dislodge demons. They will take serpents into their hands. They will drink a deadly poison that will not cause harm. What do you think he's quoting there? Also, prosper of Aquitaine. Now with Esnick, Esnick might have known the Ditesteron, which then is simply another, makes that pile that much higher. Prosper of Aquitaine, writing somewhere else entirely. And Call of Nations, Book 2, Chapter 2, says, according to Mark, Jesus speaks to the same apostles, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believes not shall be condemned. So there's prosper. Also, you could go to Marius Mercator, Marcus Aramita, and not to the point where to get through them all, I would just have to list the names and not go into the details of the composition. Nestorius, right. Leo the Great, Patrick. So Patrick out in Ireland, and Patrick isn't using the Vulgate for his quotations. He's using the Latin they have out there. Peter Chrysologus, Severus of Antioch, Leontius, Eusebius, Fulgentius, and you can just keep on going. So the amount of patristic evidence that favors the use of these verses is immense.
Absolutely. And I think you made the case very well, brother. I'll ask the question, and then I want you just to make a quick comment about next week's episode. The question from Susie, and I'm going to point it here. She's saying, are the materials that you're showing, like these images and everything else, are they available online?
Many of them are what's called the virtual manuscript room, but you might have difficulties with the format there. That's one option. At my blog, thetextofthegospels.com, if you search there, and it's not the world's greatest search engine, I think they adjusted it badly a few months ago. But if you try with effort, go to Curtisville CC and look for the text critical resources there, and look. You might have to scroll down a little bit. Find the part that says resources on Mark 69 through 20. That should take you to blog posts in which some of these materials are featured, and not every single one, but most of them are featured there in one blog post or another. Also, if you know how to work your way through a manuscript, you can go to the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. That's an organization that collects images of manuscript pages and puts them online. Many of them are also there. Not all, but a lot of them will be there.
That's wonderful. And I just want people to know this is deep topic. Our brother did an excellent research. You guys may have to watch it one more time, take notes, go and research for yourself. I mean, don't take our words for it, by the way. And somebody was saying, do we deny the ending of Mark? I don't deny the ending of Mark. That's the whole purpose why we have a show like this. So I'm not really so sure where people come up with these strange ideas. So, brother, next week we're going to talk about the section in John about the woman caught in adultery. I think it will be fair to say that this is the exact same thing that we will be doing next time, presenting these evidence and possibly images if you have any, correct?
Yes, I hopefully we'll have more images on that subject and that passage as well. That's
wonderful. Well, again, we listed, our dear brother's YouTube channel. People, make sure you go and watch his channel, subscribe to it. And if you don't mind mentioning also, I think the website or the blog that you have so that people can go and inspect that as well.
Yes, we hardly got into the internal evidence today, but the internal evidence is covered in detail in my book called Authentic, the Case for Mark 16, 9 through 20. The external evidence is covered there too, but also the internal evidence that we didn't really get into today. But that's for sale at Amazon for 99 cents because they don't let me give it away. But if anybody wants to request a copy from me, I'm happy to give away copies if they need some. And also at the NT Textual Criticism discussion group on Facebook. That's you can find it there among the files. So it's a free download. And but the blog is thetextofthegospels.com. Also, you can go to, like I said, curtisvillecc.com. That's the church where I preach. And there's a little button that says, click here for text critical resources. And that will take you to a list of passages and some other resources too, like list of manuscripts and things. But if you scroll down there to that button that says click here for resources on Mark 16:19-20, that will take you to a cornucopia of other resources.
Yeah, wonderful, brother. Thank you so much, of course, as always, for taking the time to be here with us. And folks, next week, same time on Friday at 5 p.m. New York time, our brother will be with us here to talk about the topic concerning the passage regarding the woman caught in adultery in John, which is another one of those passages that gets attacked all the time, especially from my background, from Muslims as well. And hopefully after that, myself and James will talk about other topics that he can also come in. I know he can talk about a lot of stuff. We will bring him back to talk about other issues that are very crucial and important for the body to learn how to defend the faith, where to go, how you can do your research, how you can reason with these evidence, external and internal. Again, brother, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the moderators. Thank you for those who joined us here today. May the Lord bless you all, and hope to see you possibly on Sunday. Me and Sam will be doing a show. We will announce it to you. And I have to tell you that I am in the mood of probably do a late nighter. It could be tonight. I'm not so sure. It will be we'll be doing an impromptu. And if that's the case, you can always watch it in the morning. No worries. So just to let you guys know, in case you wonder why I didn't tell you, here you go. I'm telling you, that I'm thinking about doing a late nighter. Brother, thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless you all. This is Fadi, over and out.